Hello, welcome to the online lecture on common breastfeeding barriers. By the end of this online session, the student will be able to understand common barriers to initiating breastfeeding. Now, the barriers that we touch on are barriers that impact not only initiating breastfeeding, they definitely impact the duration of breastfeeding from the birth of the baby until the baby stops breastfeeding. However, as I mentioned earlier, the way this course is structured is chronologically, starting with the type of knowledge women and their families would need during the pregnancy period to motivate them to initiate breastfeeding, and then continuing on to once the baby's born. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take out a piece of paper, and I would like you to jot down what you think are the most common barriers women perceive that might prevent them from initiating breastfeeding. Um, think about any reason that a mom may choose to formula feed. What are those reasons that they would feel uncomfortable initiating breastfeeding? Go ahead and stop the online video, jot down those barriers, and then turn the online lecture back on. So you may have listed some of these. Here's a list of 5 common barriers to initiating breastfeeding. These are definitely not all the barriers women have, but they are among the more common ones. And for the sake of time, we're going to touch on these 5 in greater depth. We'll talk about some of the issues behind each of these barriers, and then in the subsequent online lecture, we'll talk about some specific strategies you can provide women who have these concerns, help them be more motivated to initiate breastfeeding. So before we move on, a couple things I'd like you to think about. So when we're talking about the value of knowing the common barriers to breastfeeding, and then of course strategies you can arm women with to overcome those barriers, it's really the goal behind that is that we want to have the woman and her family feel completely comfortable about breastfeeding before baby's born. Pregnancy is an ideal time for educating women and their families about breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is very different than other health behaviors. When we talk about physical activity, if we were to motivate someone or try to encourage them to adopt physical activity, technically they can come to a health education class, hear your spiel about motivating them to engage in physical activity. Next day they can get up and start exercising. When it comes to breastfeeding, if we've got a pregnant mom and we educate her and motivate her to choose to breastfeed her child, the next morning she can't wake up and breastfeed that child. She has to wait till she gives birth to the baby. So over that pregnancy period, if the mom has concerns and she's on the fence about breastfeeding, we can really help address concerns she has, provide her with strategies to overcome those barriers, address inaccurate information. And so by the time the baby's born, she is truly motivated to initiate breastfeeding. So to summarize, ideally, all the perceived barriers that a woman and her family have are addressed during the prenatal period. The less barriers she has, the more likely she is to initiate breastfeeding when the baby's born. So here's those steps that we want to think about when we're working with pregnant women and their families. Number 1, we want to find out what specific barriers she or her family perceive about breastfeeding. Once we uncover those barriers, we want to provide her with specific strategies on how to overcome those barriers. And then lastly, but not least, we want to make sure she and her family have accurate knowledge about breastfeeding. If the mom has inaccurate information or her family members have inaccurate information that is preventing her from choosing to breastfeed, we'd like to provide her with the accurate information before baby's born. And that's all about dispelling breastfeeding myths. And a subsequent session that we will go into will focus on all those breastfeeding myths. So for now, let's talk about common breastfeeding barriers. Before we move on, I want to bring to your attention the assignment that you have for your next session. And it's all about strategies to overcome breastfeeding barriers. I'm going to read the assignment, and the reason is I want you, as we go through this session, I want you to take a piece of paper and write down your thoughts on specific strategies you can provide moms with to address each of these common barriers. So here's the assignment. Imagine you're a lactation educator who answers calls on a breastfeeding warm line. So a breastfeeding warm line is like a breastfeeding helpline where women and their family would call in to ask questions about breastfeeding. And again, so it could be a pregnant woman or her family member that are calling in to ask you questions about their concerns. And your supervisor has asked you to come up with key talking points that you would share with pregnant mothers and their family members who contact you about the following common concerns. So embarrassment of public breastfeeding, fear that breastfeeding will be painful, concern that breastfeeding will result in significant time and social constraints, and lack of social support for breastfeeding. So as we go through this session, take notes because you're going to use notes from today as well as the internet to come up with some key information that you would share with moms who are pregnant and their family members who contact you on this breastfeeding warm line and express the above concerns. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk about some of the common barriers to breastfeeding. So imagine someone calls this breastfeeding warm line and they say, I've heard that breastfeeding hurts. What barrier is this particular woman concerned about? That's right, it's the fear that breastfeeding will be painful. Now, how can that barrier, fear that breastfeeding will be painful, affect a mother's decision to initiate breastfeeding? Go ahead and pause the online lecture for a moment, think about it, write it down, and then turn the lecture back on once you've thought of your answer. Yeah, absolutely, you got it. Most people are not interested in adopting behaviors that will bring about pain. As humans in general, we seek pleasure and we try to avoid pain. So if I think that breastfeeding is going to be painful, it's definitely going to impact my decision to initiate breastfeeding, and I'm very likely going to choose not to. Why do you think many women have this belief? That's right. Many women have heard from their family members or friends that breastfeeding hurts. Now, is this belief true? Is breastfeeding painful? Breastfeeding does not have to be painful. It can be. About 75% of the time that a mom experiences pain while breastfeeding, it has to do with an improper latch or positioning, and it can easily be fixed with a little tweak of the latch or positioning. Sometimes there's some other reasons why breastfeeding would be painful, very rare, but maybe the baby has a short frenulum. The frenulum is a little piece of skin right underneath the tongue, and when the frenulum is short, then the baby can't extend their tongue out when breastfeeding, and what happens is that as they're breastfeeding, their tongue will flick the nipple, and after a while it will cause some irritation and some cracking and can be painful. This could easily be alleviated with clipping the frenulum, which doesn't hurt at all, but again, very rare. So breastfeeding shouldn't hurt. How about this? Let's say a mom calls and she says, if I breastfeed, I won't be able to work, go to school, or go out with my friends. Yeah, that's a concern that breastfeeding will result in serious social constraints, meaning that the mom won't be able to work, she can't go to school, she can't go out with friends, essentially she just can't do anything. How do you think this concern might influence a mom's decision to breastfeed? Yeah, if I think that breastfeeding will prevent me from doing anything, I'm really unlikely to want to initiate breastfeeding. Why do you think many women have this belief? Well, some of the common reasons women believe that breastfeeding is going to negatively impact their social life has to do with the fact that they don't know anyone who is able to continue breastfeeding when they went back to work or school. So if you don't have a role model where you've seen them be successful at combining work and school, or being able to go out with friends and manage maintaining their milk supply and having a life, then it's going to be really difficult for you to even imagine that it's possible. A lot of women don't know how to successfully breastfeed when they're separated from their baby, meaning They don't actually know logistically what they need to do. They don't know how a pump works. They don't know how frequently they need to pump. They don't know how to prepare breast milk that's been pumped, how to store it. So all that specific hands-on knowledge on how it all works to be separated from a baby and still maintain their milk supply is unknown to them, and therefore they can't even imagine this being possible. Another reason that women commonly think that breastfeeding will completely negatively impact their social life is they have a misperception that breastfeeding will result in their baby becoming overly dependent on them. And so, meaning that if they don't give baby a bottle and they just breastfeed, that baby's never going to take a bottle and they'll never be able to do anything. The baby will be glued to their breast for life. This is actually not true. There is no research to suggest that a breastfed baby is more dependent than a bottle-fed baby. There are some babies who don't take bottles, and under those circumstances, a lot of these babies do something called reverse cycle nursing. And what that is that they reverse their cycle of breastfeeding. Instead of eating a lot during the day, what they do is if their mom's away during the day, they eat a lot at night. And what this would look like is mom goes to work, maybe she goes from 9 to 5, the baby eats once, maybe a few or twice at most during the day. And as soon as the mom comes home, maybe she's home at 5:30, that baby eats every 2 hours at 5:30, 7:30, 9:30, 11:30, 1:30, 3:30, 5:30, 7:30, and they get all of their feedings in the nighttime. Here's another concern. What is this woman who's calling your warm line concerned about? My partner said that he was not breastfed and he turned out fine. That's right. This is all about lack of support for breastfeeding. Now, how might lack of support influence a woman's decision to initiate breastfeeding? Well, it can be really challenging to breastfeed if you don't have support. Breastfeeding takes a long time. In the early period, the baby is about 3 to 4 months. Moms need to feed about 8 to 12 times in 24 hours. And in the early days, it can take about 45 minutes per feeding. That's a lot of time spent on the couch, sitting and feeding. And if you don't have a supportive partner or family members, they may feel that you're slacking off with your responsibilities at home, sitting on the couch and breastfeeding while the dishes pile up, while the laundry piles up. So support can make a huge impact on a woman's decision to breastfeed and also to continue breastfeeding. Why do you think significant others and close family members may not be supportive about breastfeeding? Take a moment to think about it. Well, a lot of it has to do with lack of knowledge about breastfeeding, lack of knowledge about the benefits of breastfeeding, lack of knowledge about how breastfeeding works, lack of knowledge about what it takes to successfully build a good milk supply to feed baby. And also sometimes it's actually related to fear that the mom will bond more with the baby and the significant other or other family member will feel left out. Before we go on to the next barrier, I'm going to show you this short little clip to give you some food for thought about how to get dads to be more supportive.
Oh, Baba.
Fathers can be involved. You know, we're every bit as important in the process here. I like to think that I'm kind of a pro with burping.
I try to do everything that I can up until the point of breastfeeding. I will get Camille up for bed, change her diaper, then I hand her off to Dana.
At night, she may be tired. That's when I step in, walk around with him, feed him. There are a lot of opportunities for you to still bond with your child, even though she is, breastfeeding.
As much as I love working with moms and babies, I enjoy even more working with dads. Fathers are such an important part of a breastfeeding relationship. And if I could wish for one thing, it would be for more dads to step forward and talk about breastfeeding and let other dads know how important they are, what a difference they make and how much moms need to know that their support is there.
Here's the next barrier I want to touch on. Let's say a mom calls and says, I'm afraid I won't have any milk just like my mother. What's that about? What are they concerned about? That's right, lack of confidence regarding milk production. This is a very common barrier. Now, how can lack of confidence regarding milk production impact a woman's decision to initiate breastfeeding? Yeah, absolutely. If I'm afraid that, or I think that I'm not making enough milk for my baby, I'm concerned that I'm going to cause my baby to starve, they won't gain weight, they won't grow adequately. There's no way I'm going to initiate breastfeeding. I don't want to hurt my baby. I just want my baby to be healthy. So definitely this barrier can impact a woman's decision to initiate breastfeeding. Why do you think moms lack confidence about their milk production? Take a moment, pause the video, and jot down your responses. So a lot of times a woman's belief that they're not producing enough milk to nourish their baby is based on inaccurate knowledge about breastfeeding. And so some of those reasons are things such as how to establish and maintain a good milk supply, normal breastfed babies' feeding patterns, and then also who can and can't successfully breastfeed. And so what I mean by that is that if you recall our online lecture on anatomy and physiology of lactation, we talked about what it really takes to build a good milk supply. Does anyone remember? Yeah, that's right. It's frequent and effective removal of breast milk. So if my baby I'm feeding my baby every time the baby's hungry, and the baby's effectively stimulating my breast and there's effective milk transfer, my body will produce what my baby needs. If I'm not feeding my baby frequently and they're not effectively feeding, my body will not make enough milk for that baby. But women have inaccurate knowledge about what it takes to build a good milk supply. Some women think if they have small breasts, they can't produce breast milk. Other people think that if their mom couldn't produce, then genetically speaking, they're not able to produce. So some of this perception about the inability or lack of confidence that they'll be able to produce enough milk has to do with inaccurate knowledge about how to establish and maintain good milk supply. Another big reason that women and their family think that they won't produce enough milk is that they don't know the difference between a normal breastfed baby's feeding patterns and a formula-fed baby's feeding patterns. We're going to get into this in much greater depth in a future session called Getting Breastfeeding Started. But for now, I want to touch on a few differences between a normal breastfed baby and a formula-fed baby and how lack of knowledge of those differences can cause a mom to doubt that she'll be able to produce enough milk. And so normal breastfed babies eat about every 1.5 hours to 3 hours. Formula-fed babies eat every 4 hours. So let's say I'm at home with my mom, grandma of the baby, and she formula fed me, and she knows that babies eat every 4 hours based on her experience feeding me. She's watching me, she's hanging out around the house, and my child is eating every 1.5 to 3 hours. And she starts to think, that's kind of odd. What might she be thinking? Yeah, she might be thinking, well, wait a minute, what's going on? What's wrong? Are you not making enough milk? Why is your baby hungry all the time? And she might start to doubt that I'm producing enough milk. And she may share her doubts with me. And then what's going to happen? Yeah, she's going to make me doubt that I'm making enough milk. And if I'm thinking I'm not making enough milk for baby, what might I start doing? I might start to supplement with formula. And then what's going to happen? Yep, you're right. First I perceived I wasn't making enough milk. Then I went ahead and started supplementing because I thought I wasn't making enough milk. And then guess what? Now my body is making less milk. And I'm not making enough milk for my baby anymore. Another difference between a breastfed baby and a formula-fed baby that causes women to doubt that they're producing enough is something called cluster feeding. Very normal for a breastfed baby to cluster feed. What that's about is basically usually late afternoon, the baby will feed in bunches, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and then they take a long stretch, maybe a 4 or 5 hour stretch. Hopefully they take that stretch at night. But those cluster feeds, they're normal. Formula fed babies don't do that. They eat every 4 hours. So again, if grandma's over helping with dinner and she's noticing that the baby's eating every hour, what might she be thinking? Or what might she share with you? Yeah, well, what's going on? Why is your baby so hungry? Are you sure you're making enough milk? Then again, you might start doubting the amount of your milk production. You may start supplementing, and before you know it, guess what? You're making less milk. And last but not least, in terms of inaccurate information that can cause moms to doubt they're producing enough or will produce enough is inaccurate knowledge about who can and can't breastfeed. And that has to do with various myths about breastfeeding. We'll go into more depth about that when we discuss a breastfeeding myths and misperceptions assignment. Now here's one more common barrier I want to talk about. You got a mom who calls and says, I know breastfeeding is best for my baby, but I'm embarrassed to breastfeed in public. What might this mom be concerned about? Yeah, you got it. Embarrassed of public breastfeeding. How can this barrier influence a mother's decision to initiate breastfeeding? Well, for one, as we talked about before, babies in the early period, the first 3 to 4 months, they typically eat anywhere between an hour and a half and 3 hours. So it's logistically impossible for the mom to do anything without having to feed that baby. So if you're embarrassed to go out into public and feed your baby, you're not going to be able to do anything. So definitely it's going to impact a mom's decision to breastfeed. Why do you think many women have this belief? Go ahead and pause the online video and think about it. What is it that causes women to feel embarrassed to breastfeed in public? So a lot of it does have to do with social norms about breastfeeding, including lack of normalization regarding breastfeeding and also sexualization of the breast. So when we think about breastfeeding in public, a lot of people get a little uneasy with that. It's not something that they see a lot, and when they do see it, they feel very uncomfortable. It's not normal. And on the other hand, the breasts are sexualized. They're not seen as its functional organ used to feed a baby. Instead, they're viewed as something sexual. And so these social norms about the breast, what it's used for and what it's not used for, cause a lot of embarrassment around public breastfeeding. I'd like to show you a couple media clips, a cartoon and some video clips that do a really good job of describing why it is that women are embarrassed to breastfeed in public. So let's look first at this comic strip. Nursing, this is a shopping mall. We can't allow women to presently display their breasts. So here you have this woman discreetly breastfeeding. You can't see any breast. You see a little bit of her neck exposed, and these security guards are outrageous. Oh my God, what are you doing breastfeeding in a mall? And lo and behold, right behind her, huge poster of a woman wearing a bra with tons of cleavage exposed, completely fine. Nobody's getting up in arms about this, but this poor woman who is discreetly breastfeeding is made to feel that she's doing something indecent. And right behind her, you've got major exposure. The short video does a great job of depicting how public breastfeeding isn't viewed as normal. It's called If Eating Was Like Breastfeeding. I love that video clip. I think it's an excellent depiction of how moms often feel when they breastfeed in public. So if you've never personally experienced how the public expresses their opinion about public breastfeeding to a mother who's breastfeeding in public, you may assume that it's not really that big of a deal and it's not that bad. This short clip does a great job of summarizing all the different kinds of comments a breastfeeding mom may hear when they breastfeed in public.
You're gonna do that right here? Here? You still breastfeeding? Huh. Couldn't be me. Once they can ask for it, they can get a bottle.
Don't you think if they can ask for it, they're too old?
There's a lot of men around.
There are lots of men here.
I don't see why you just can't cover up.
Oh, let me help you out. Here, put this on. Cover that up? Just want to make sure you're comfortable.
You know, some parents just don't want their children to see that.
There are children here. Some parents aren't ready to explain that to their children. I mean, I don't want to be offensive or anything, but I just don't understand why women can't just pump, put it in a bottle, and carry that and use that one in public.
I just don't understand why you can't put it in a bottle. What, can you not afford formula? You mean he doesn't drink cow's milk?
Can the baby have formula? Well, you can't afford formula?
I ain't letting no baby suck on my titties.
These are for my husband. That's sexual. Boyfriend, like, your baby? I don't know. It's just like mixing stuff up that I don't think. I don't know. Do you though?
Does it feel gross? Can't the baby get too much breast milk? How do you know they're getting enough? Won't that make your breast sag?
It's kind of nasty.
You must be African or something.
What's supposed to go in the refrigerator, so what do you do about that? Isn't it hot?
If God wanted us to use breast, he wouldn't have needed it about bottles.
All I'm saying is God invented formula, right? So
I'm just saying, God would not have invented bottles if we were supposed to breastfeed.
breastfeeding is just like, it's such a special, sacred, bonding experience between a mother and a child. Wouldn't you prefer to do that in a private room?
In the other room,
Right here?
wouldn't you feel more comfortable in the bathroom, in a car?
So when do you plan to stop breastfeeding?
How long are you gonna do that?
Like, I get it, breast is best, and, you know, but like, the baby's 3 months old now.
I can't believe you're still nursing her. Doesn't he have teeth? Oh my God, you're still doing that? Wow, you must be really comfortable with yourself.
Right here?
Does it taste like what you just ate? Doesn't it feel gross? Breast milk? What's that?
Talking a little bit about how many women are embarrassed to breastfeed in public and how the public feels about breastfeeding. Now I'd like to ask you to answer these questions about how you feel about public breastfeeding. Look at the photo here of the woman with the bra, and I want you to rate your level of agreement with the following statement. It is normal to see images like this on posters displayed in the window at the mall. Agree, neither agree or disagree. Go ahead, shut the video off for a moment, take a minute to think about it, select your answer, write it down, and turn the video back on. Same photo. Again, I'd like you to rate your level of agreement with the following statement. I'm comfortable with seeing images like this on posters displayed in the window at the mall. Agree, neither agree or disagree. Again, pause the video, select your response. Now take a look at this photo. You've got this mom breastfeeding in the park, and rate your level of agreement with the following statement. It is normal to see images like this in parks and malls. Agree, neither agree or disagree. Go ahead, turn the video off again, select your response, and then turn the video back on. Same photo. Now rate your level of agreement with the following statement. I'm comfortable when mothers breastfeed their babies near me in a public place such as a shopping center, bus station, park, etc. Rate if you agree, neither agree or disagree, Pause the video again, select your response, and then turn the video back on. Same photo, one more question, and rate your level of agreement with the following statement. Again, same photo, rate your level of agreement with the following statement. I believe women should have the right to breastfeed in public places. Agree, neither agree, or disagree, Pause, select your answer, and then turn the video back on. Okay, now let's look at how the public feels about public breastfeeding. We talked, generally speaking, by showing a cartoon, a video clip about how people perceive public breastfeeding, but let's look at some actual data from a survey. I want you to compare what your own attitudes about public breastfeeding are that you just assessed for yourself with what the nation thinks. So this data comes from a national survey conducted once a year. Basically, this survey collects health-related opinions of men and women over the age of 18 in the United States. A variety of breastfeeding topics have been included in this survey. They ask about health-related topics other than breastfeeding, but they do ask the public about breastfeeding topics, things like their opinion about public breastfeeding, breastfeeding policies, their beliefs about the benefits of breastfeeding, and it is a survey that is conducted annually. There have been questions regarding breastfeeding on this survey since 1999, and recently, from the 2015 survey, they also asked some questions about public breastfeeding, and particularly those questions are the ones I'd like to talk about. So number one, through this survey, we found that a little over half of Americans are comfortable when mothers breastfeed their babies near them in a public place, such as a shopping center, bus station, etc. And also, a little over half of Americans believe that mothers should have the right to breastfeed in public places. So you can see in the United States, we still have a lot of work to do with respect to normalizing public breastfeeding. We have a little over 50% of the population in the United States that think that moms should have the right to breastfeed in public places and that are actually comfortable when they see a mother breastfeed in a public place. Now, since almost half of Americans don't view public breastfeeding as normal, and subsequently a lot of women are embarrassed to breastfeed in public, recently in an attempt to address this barrier at a community level, there have been some interventions that have been implemented to help normalize breastfeeding. And so the goal of these interventions is by normalizing breastfeeding, women will no longer need to be embarrassed to breastfeed in public. It will be a non-issue because it will just be something that is considered normal. I'd like to talk about a few of these initiatives. This clip that I'm going to show you shortly comes from a documentary that's currently being produced to normalize breastfeeding among the African American community, and this particular segment focuses on reducing the stigma associated with breastfeeding in public.
My name's Janelle and I have two daughters. Noelle is 6 and Adele is going to be 4. I breastfed both of my girls for about 22 months. My biggest regret is not breastfeeding in public more often because there's such a shame and a stigma that comes with breastfeeding. And I've experienced it for myself. People have been like, well, why are you still breastfeeding? I mean, my baby was 6 weeks old when I was asked that question. And it's not normal in American society for you to breastfeed your child. And I hid all the time. I breastfed in the car or in rooms at my friends' houses. I ate cold meals. I put my babies under blankets when they didn't want to be under blankets. And I remember sometimes they would be hot and like sweating. And I just wish that I hadn't have done that. And even though my husband was a big proponent of breastfeeding, I think initially he wanted me to cover. It took me a long time to gain that confidence because even women who were breastfeeding were not supportive of public breastfeeding. I want more women to do it. I wish I had done it more. I think public breastfeeding is really going to help normalize it in our society.
And here's another initiative focused on normalizing breastfeeding. And so Breastfeeding Coalitions throughout the U.S. actually it launched campaigns to help normalize breastfeeding by doing photo montages. Essentially what they did is they'd go ahead and photograph women nursing in different public settings, and then they put together this photo montage. And the rationale behind this is that since a lot of people in the public don't see breastfeeding in public because so many people are embarrassed to breastfeed in public, if they create this photo montage of women breastfeeding in public, the more they see it, the more they'll realize that it's normal, and the more normal it will become. So I'd like to show you this photo montage that was created it's called the Madison Project. For the sake of time, I paused that video, but again, the goal was to show you some initiatives that are focused on normalizing breastfeeding. Now, to wrap up this session, I'm going to read a statement, and then I want you to guess what most likely this woman who is making this statement is concerned about. My breasts are too small. Yes, she's most likely worried that she's going to be producing enough milk to nourish her baby. How about this one? I want to pump and put it in a bottle. Yeah, that one's about embarrassment of public breastfeeding. Many times moms who are embarrassed to breastfeed in public say, you know what, I want to give my baby breast milk, but I'm too embarrassed, so I'm just going to put it in a bottle. I don't know anyone in my family who has ever done that before. Yeah, that's about lack of support. How about this? I quit last time because it hurt so bad. Yeah, definitely fear of pain. What about I won't be able to go anywhere? What's that about? Time and social constraints. What about I want my mom partner to help feed the baby? Yeah, that's all about lack of support. How about my friend says it hurts? Fear of pain. What about this? Since I have to go back to work, it won't be worth the bother. Yeah, time and social constraints. How about I only want to breastfeed at home? Embarrassment of public breastfeeding. And last but not least, my mother says we can't make milk in our family. Yeah, lack of support.